Hey, I'm Adrian, one of the hosts of After Adult Podcast. My porn name should be Mozart Fremont, but you probably know me better by my actual porn name, Siri.
I'm Rachel, but my porn name would be Woody 16th Avenue.
After Adult is a podcast about life and porn.
I don't actually watch porn.
I don't really watch that much porn either. I probably watch more than you, but I mean, most of the time it kind of would feel like going to work on my day off.
You 100% watch more than me because I don't watch porn. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for After Adult.
Or visit afteradult.com and follow us on Instagram at afteradult.
Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. This week we're talking to Heather Berg, author of Porn Work, Sex, Labor, and Late Capitalism.
Hello, this is Chelsea Poe from TroubledFilms.com. I'm here to tell you about getting access to hot BDSM, queer, trans, and dyke porn all in one place. With code PEEPSHOW21, you can get 21% off your next order from TroubledFilms.com. Again, that's code PEEPSHOW21, TroubledFilms.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Peep Show podcast.
Welcome. PJ, you are here.
I am here. See, I got to say welcome back.
I know. I told them in the last episode that this time you're going to be back.
And I am.
Yeah. Well, I missed you, so I'm glad you're back. I missed you in the house that we've been quarantined in for a year.
I'm both alive, which, this time last year was debatable. It was definitely rough. And so, I spent a year recovering from cancer.
Yeah.
And
you have all your hair.
I have all my hair, or most of my hair. And I also have a newly minted PhD. So
yeah, Dr. PJ.
Yes. So I have time to live again. So that's
it's
good.
Amazing. So we've been saying like that PJ will be back once he finishes his PhD, and it is done. And they didn't even want you to do anything else. You're just done. They were like, very good, Dr.
See,
PJ.
We weren't lying. Here I am.
Yeah, so it's really exciting. So PJ is going to be a more active part of the Peep Show podcast now, which I'm excited about because I think that there are some fans of the show that missed our silly banter. So I'm happy to have you back.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Yeah. So this week we have Heather Berg on talking about her new book.
Which I have to say, I am totally geeking out about.
Yeah.
I love this book. I think that Heather's doing something really amazing here. She's, this is a book that's based in interviews with lots of different people in the porn industry, talking about working conditions in the porn industry. And I think it's just like a really honest take on, what it's like to work on the porn industry. And what I really appreciate about this book, and it's just very nuanced, and she acknowledges when people have different experiences and conflicting experiences about the industry. Yeah. And she doesn't try to wrap everything up in a neat bow and present this is the one true story about the porn industry.
Which is actually a really hard thing to do because you have when you work in porn, you have these conflicting forces that you're trying to fight against. So you have the anti-porn feminists who are all porn is bad. And so there's this really intense kind of drive to be no, it's not. It's great. We're all totally happy in it. And you can, it can be the, best possible option for a lot of people. But, I think that one of the things that Heather does is talk about how it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Right. And at the same time, you also have managers who are trying to pay you as little as possible. And and, not, and kind of offload as much of the work and costs onto you as they can.
Yeah.
And so, like, there also needs to be space to talk about, like, crappy labor practices or, like, abusive people. And so, that's always a needle to kind of thread for those of us who work in the industry. And what I really like about this book is I truly think it's like the first academic book about the porn industry that I think really captures that complexity.
Yeah.
It really, it tells both sides of those stories while being critical of like overly simplistic narratives. And it's very much like centering the folks who work in the industry and
also like paying the folks who work in the industry like a lot of respect for their like inventiveness and creativity and resilience in these like very complicated jobs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought was really great about the book is the kind of playing with and going back and forth between like this notion of like sex work as work that comes out very strongly from the sex worker rights movement, and then the idea that like, and trying to talk about like porn as a job, but also recognizing that it's not a job like other jobs. I mean, the book ends with a like fuck jobs, afterward. And I think that moving between those like things of saying like, yes, we can declare that we should have rights as workers, but also like we don't really want to be workers. And I think that tension comes across like really well in the book.
Right. Yeah, and especially not be sort of subject to like the exploitative and abusive aspects of capitalism, which is sort of like implied in a job, right? And so I don't know. I have so many good things to say. I'll be honest. I was finishing up my dissertation to get my PhD. So much of my dissertation was sort of whining about the lack of good academic scholarship on the porn industry. I mean, there's been some other good scholarship on the porn industry. There's a journal, Porn Studies, which was started like 7-8 years ago, which has put out a lot of good things. But there wasn't this kind of systematic work. And, when the page proofs came out for this, I was just so excited. I like had to go and I changed, so much of my dissertation. I was just so inspired by this book.
Oh, yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. It's funny because you came after you finished reading it. I remember you coming and saying, I'm going to be able to publish parts of my dissertation because this book exists. And I thought that was a really powerful thing to say.
Yeah. I mean, in part because I felt like I really felt a struggle that there was just like a hole in the literature. And, there's so much I felt like the academic literature was getting wrong and that I needed to explain, but to now have something else to reference to be like, oh, well, here's, someone getting it right. It makes it so much easier, to be able to not have to like fight that fight alone, but to say, yeah, I don't like the way that, a lot of academic conversations or just public conversations in general, are happening with regards to the porn industry, and I don't like the way that they try to put people into, the box of either empowerment or like, total exploitation. Right. But now, you can point to somebody who has a more nuanced take and who really, spells it out like systematically across a book.
Yeah.
And I think that's just, it's actually a relief, as somebody else who's working in the field, writing about the porn industry. Yeah.
And it was a really like good conversation between all of us about like the working conditions in porn and how to like think about working in this industry and what it means. So I think we should just like go straight into the interview.
Agreed. Let's do it.
Who misses free and affordable ads and social networks without the anti-sex work rhetoric, Assembly 4 is a team of sex workers and technologists in Melbourne, Australia, aiming to bring back free and fair advertising and social spaces to the sex working community. They also give back to organizations based in harm reduction, sex work, and education. Stepping away from the clunky design of traditional platforms, their two products, Tryst.link and Switter.at, are refreshing and well-needed changes in both presentation and mission. Both are free to join and open to all. In the words of an A4 user, from the policies to the language to the advice and tips, it makes such a big difference to feel encouraged and supported instead of policed. Check out their website, assembly4.com, for the word and not the number, for more info. We have with us today Heather Berg, who writes about sex, work, and social struggles. She is the author of Porn Work and assistant professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Washington University in St. Louis. So welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me.
Do you want to hear something that I just remembered when I read your bio?
Yeah.
Is that when I graduated from college, I was applying to graduate schools and I applied to your master's program in philosophy and I got in, but I didn't go.
Oh, I mean, we've talked about this before. The idea of you navigating philosophy is just so amazing to me because I think of it as like such a conservative space.
It's funny you say
is.
that. That's literally how we met. Is because I just moved back to Pittsburgh and I saw her dating profile, and like I could read between the lines, and I was like, "Oh my God, are you going to the philosophy program that she was in, and how are you surviving that?"
Right.
Because I had gone there, like, I don't know, 6 years earlier or something, and it was terrible for women. And
it was still terrible for women when I was there.
And I mean, a part of the reason I left was that the climate, you just couldn't really do the kinds of work that we do. That's actually how we met, was to talk about this program and how the heck she was surviving it.
It's so funny because on our first date, I was still in the PhD program that I was in, and he was like, "Why are you doing this? Why don't you just go to a program where you could actually do the work that you want to do?" And I was so idealistic then, and I was like, "I think we should fight from within and blah, 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 blah." And then like a year or two later, I was like, "Oh my God, fuck this. I don't want to fight with these guys anymore."
Totally.
Done.
And they just make you talk about the demos all the time.
Yes.
Well, that's a good origin story.
Yeah, that's the beginning of our relationship. So, but yeah, it was kind of terrible. And now, I mean, we all have so much in common because now PJ is in a women and gender and sexuality studies program.
Yeah.
That's right.
Which I feel.
Or not anymore, I suppose.
Oh, no, I am. I went to sociology, and then I switched over to women and gender and sexuality studies. So I've made the rounds. I have to.
I just meant post-graduation.
Oh, post-graduation. Yeah, right. I am done. That's funny.
Yes.
Thank God.
Yeah, but your PhD was in sociology, not in GSWS.
It was.
Yeah.
My friend wrote me an email after I defended, and it was just, "They can't hurt you anymore." That was the email.
So welcome. Sorry, I derailed with my story of a program I didn't go to, but that was a funny coincidence.
So you wrote a book.
I did. Yeah, I turned it in so long ago. I was telling Jesse I needed to refresh my memory about what it's about, but here we are.
Really?
I mean, I turned it in a year ago, January, and then the pandemic hit, so it was just, things were slow. But I'm excited to see it almost out in the world.
So let's do what we're here to do. And talk about the content of the book. So
PJ's like, stay on track.
So the book's titled Porn Work, Sex, Labor, and Late Capitalism. Do you want to tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, I started the project thinking about what felt like a lack of attention on porn as a job The book starts out, every scene is a record of people at work, and that felt missing for me in a lot of the conversations that we have about it, both in my field and women's studies and porn studies more broadly. So I wanted to think about those stories, and in some ways set out to do a kind of traditional labor study. I wanted to ask people what their days looked like, how they got paid, how they negotiated, and those kinds of questions, how they navigated hierarchy, on the set shop floor. And in some ways, the project did take those directions, but as you saw, it also that initial impulse got confronted in the interview process in all sorts of ways, and a lot of people told me that they do porn precisely because it doesn't feel like a job. And so the project emerged in a direction that wanted to really take that seriously and think about what it means for this industry to be both a space that looks in many ways a lot like other kinds of jobs, and also a space in which people can refuse some of the things that make other jobs so violent and so tedious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's really seems to be, I mean, how you just explained that seems to be kind of your approach to most things in the book, is this kind of dialectical way of talking about it, where it's this, but also this, and talking about how there are these conflicts or tensions or contradictions in so many dimensions of the porn industry, rather than just saying one thing is true and the other thing is not true.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I just, as the fieldwork and interviews unfolded, I was just constantly blown away by how creatively people are navigating those conflicts. And I think for me, focusing on the dialectical piece lets us get to that creative part, that struggle part, rather than just a story about how people are kind of ground down by their conditions or have conflicting ideas about them that show that people are wrong about what they think of their jobs, but it's actually that they're right, that both of these things are true at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So how far were you into the interview process when you felt like, wait, this can't be just a story about how this is a job like other jobs?
That's a great question. And I'm trying to think about what number in the interviews I started to confront that. But I think it pretty quickly, folks started to tell me stories about the civilian jobs that they'd left. And that mattered for me because again, like part of my original thinking was to highlight the ways that this is unexceptional, that and much of that was pitched to anti-porn feminists to say, like, you think this is an exceptional kind of non-work, an exceptional kind of violence, but really it's a lot like working retail, which is something that just being in sex worker communities more broadly is something that, of course, we like talk about all of the time, the ways that sometimes this really feels like clocking in. And so I also, in interviews, never asked people what other kinds of jobs they'd done, because it felt like that would be to flirt with this sort of like, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?
Yeah.
And I didn't want to do that. And yet people brought it up all of the time.
Yeah.
They talked about how extractive their retail jobs had been, how food service left them just kind of gutted at the end of the day. And it just became really clear to me that to talk about porn in a way that suggested that it was just like those other things would be really to do a disservice to those stories.
Yeah.
And you're saying that because in part of the stories that you heard from people is that they were fleeing these other jobs in order to, or fleeing to porn to get away from these other kinds of work. Is that like a fair representation?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's become really important for me in talking about porn work and sex work, but also all sorts of informal and gig labor, to really be explicit about the kinds of jobs that people leave in favor of these fields. And that's because just so much of the conversation is weighted in this direction of this sort of like parading stories of how bad precarious work is. But I think we always have to remember, and it's porn workers who taught me this, that that for most people, this is a choice, and I don't mean that in a kind of liberal way, but this is something that folks do in lieu of something else.
Right. I've been really struck by this in my work too, both in the fact that like I am a sex worker, but also in the form of like just interviewing a lot of people like on the podcast and through my writing, of having the same sort of experience talking to people. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting that I didn't really think about prior to 5 years ago when I kind of immersed myself in this world of sex workers is that it's also like very interwoven with like disability and like these choices. And again, I'm not saying this in a liberal way either, but these decisions to work in porn or in other forms of sex work often have a lot to do with the fact that there is this sort of like flexibility that conventional employment just doesn't offer you.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's something that I really under-theorized in this book, and that being in conversation and community with folks in the intervening years, it's made me think more deeply about in the work that I'm doing right now. But yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I would also just say that in the conversations with porn workers, like what emerged is that, of course, what we define as disability is so narrow, and that folks, regardless of whether they identify as disabled or certainly whether they have a diagnosis, talk all the time about how disabling in a broad sense work can be. So thinking about the kind of depression that comes from the tedium of sitting in an office under fluorescent lights. And I don't say that to kind of generalize out and lose the specificity of folks who are dealing with acute disability, but that's just to say that the everyday rules of straight work take their toll on minds and bodies in all sorts of ways. So I think that you're right. That's something that seems really key to this story.
I've done certainly a smaller sample of research, but I did some similar research with CAM models for my dissertation. And I heard very similar stories of a lot of people seeking flexibility in their work because they had caretaking roles, needed to take care of family members, children, or because, they had, certain kinds of conditions or situations that made it very difficult for them to conform to the sort of expectations of straight work, or like you said, that the straight work itself was disabling. So certainly, I heard a lot of discussion of the desirability of that flexibility. But one of the points you do make in the book is that, on the other hand, that also comes with a loss of security, and that we have this kind of porn work is very much a part of the gig economy that loses a lot of the kinds of benefits that one historically gained from more conventional employment.
Yeah, I mean, and what I try to make clear in the book, and as a drum I'll beat with labor historians anytime I get the chance, is just that security was elusive even for workers who the narrative tell us, had it at the time. So that like Fordism was bad for a lot of people, especially for precarious workers of color, for a lot of feminized workers. And certainly now to be a full-time worker gives one access to some labor protections that aren't available to gig workers, but also that those protections are fading, and we're always so weak, even for folks who made the sacrifice of clocking in for a 9 to 5. I'm thinking about, and I'm forgetting whose quote it is, but there's a piece in We Too, the book that Jesse's beautiful essay just came out in, that talks about how workers in this country are treated like shit, whether they're employees or not. And so I always want to return to that when we're thinking about gig work and independent contractor status.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of that is really important. And I think that this is a good time for this book, I think, because there is like so much discussion right now of the like changing in the in the structure of like how we work. And I think this has been, not just because of Uber and Lyft, which, a lot of people talk about as like the example of like what's going on here and why this is a problem, but also like with COVID, which is like completely changing people's relationship to work. And so I think it's interesting how you talk about the fact that there are a lot of criticisms of the gig economy, but on the other hand, like there's a lot of reasons why people have like fled to that. And I would consider myself to be one of those people in order to, move out of the constraints of conventional employment, but that's not like a panacea to fix all of your problems.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess that's the tension I'm just trying to really ask readers to sit with that. And that, talking about Uber and Lyft, just to remember that like, no one wants to go back to driving a cab either. Like there's, and people aren't stupid for desiring something else. And at the same time, there are all of these ways that techno-capitalists can exploit that, whether we're talking, Uber or OnlyFans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the points you make in the book that I think is kind of really, thoughtful along those lines is this discussion of the ways that people try to escape the kind of tedium or pressures or problematic aspects of work by kind of moving up the hierarchy. And how, particularly within like the contemporary context of porn, people are like hustling in all these different ways, trying to also like not just be the worker, but find ways to also be the boss as a way to escape the worker, or find ways to self-produce, find ways to, reposition themselves in order to escape that. But at the same time, that also is in tension with the fact that those kinds of moves still reproduce the kind of, capitalist system that creates the kind of work that they're ultimately seeking to escape, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the trickiest things, that how to write a Marxist labor ethnography about people who don't want to be workers is, I think, a methodological question that I absolutely animated so much of where the book ended up going, and I think it inspired me to think differently about the ways that Marxists talk about class, because I think that porn work offers, I think, more and better opportunities to hustle and to climb the ranks, as kind of tenuous as those can be. And I think that porn workers are often more creative and savvier than a lot of straight workers. But I don't think that the desire is unique to porn. And I think that this taught me that a lot of workers don't want to be workers. And so I think, who knows, my one hope with this is that this book won't be just read by people who already think they're interested in sex work, but that labor scholars might take porn workers' interventions here seriously in terms of how we think about these questions more broadly.
Do you feel like, one of the reasons maybe that porn workers are like more creative and savvy is because it's attracting people who are willing to kind of step outside of the mainstream, like it's already attracting those creative people? Or do you think that the people who make it within it like have those qualities? Like, what do you think the reason for that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it's true that a lot of folks are, Carter Stevens and quoted in the books, like, we're outlaws. This is what brings folks here. And I think that's really real for a lot of people. There's also, as a lot of working class people who have rent to pay, and this is one way to do it. And I don't know that there's a set of personality traits associated with that.
Sure. Right.
But I do think that being in a job that offers really, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, because I think this is good from the perspective of actually moving us somewhere more interesting in terms of what work could mean. But I don't think that sex work will ever be really integrated into respectable work. And and again, I think that's a good thing, you know, insofar as we can also get rights. So, but yeah, I think that being on the margins in that way gives people a clearer vision of the center, and that's of course something that that feminists and queer theorists have been thinking about for a long time, and it's something that I'm in this sense like inviting labor theorists to take more seriously too.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So big picture, you know, you wrote this book at a moment where, you know, the sex worker rights movement is rallying behind the slogan, sex work is work, you know, at least large portions of the community. But at the same time, you literally end the book on the phrase fuck jobs. So can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. I mean, and I'll say, you know, it wasn't taking the story in that direction wasn't uncomplicated for me. I came to the research having been involved with sex worker organizing before I even went to graduate school. That's the set of politics, not that it's one coherent set, but you know, it's a political movement that I'm most aligned with. And it's one that, you know, I think like a lot of graduate students had some hopes that I might contribute to it in some small way. I think that in the intervening years, I've become a lot more circumspect about the possibility that academia could do that, but that's another question.
That's hitting close to home.
I'm sorry. Yes, we can talk when you've done your job to process about that. But I think my responsibilities as an ethnographer are also really real, and that's to say that I don't think it would have been responsible to tell a story in a too tidy way that feeds directly into sex workers' work narratives at the expense of ignoring, you know, what people who gave me their time for this told me. And I also think that because of the real ways that a lot of folks seek out sex work because it doesn't feel like work, I'm sympathetic to critiques from folks who are sex worker activists who are not sure about the work framing, you know. And I think that if the wins from a kind of too tidy sex workers work perspective will feel very hollow for people who seek out the industry toward other means. And I'll just say, I'm thinking alongside Femi Babylon on this has been really clarifying for me. But certainly lots of folks in the book, you know, pushed me in that direction. And one thing that I love about sex workers movements is this sort of comfort with talking out of both sides of the mouth, you know. So like, I think there's no need to be earnest. Like we can in the space of lobbying say, this is work and work that I do to support my family in an honest way or whatever, and make that demand and hopefully win, and then also sustain a really vital critique of work itself, and never, you know, buy into this idea that you have to work hard in order to, you know, earn your right to a living.
Right. It's interesting. A couple of few months ago, maybe in November or December, I had Caitlin Bailey on the podcast, and who runs the Oldest Profession podcast. And one of the things that she was saying when we were talking was that she also wants to get away from this framing of like sex work as work, or in favor of talking about sex worker rights more within the like LGBTQ framework. And I thought that was really interesting, because one of the things that she was saying is that like along with work comes ideas of like regulation and intervention that don't seem to be advantageous to sex workers at all. Yeah, and I thought that was also really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that was also something that was really challenging for me in doing this research, was that I came to it, again, from a more kind of straightforward sex workers work perspective, and started doing the research just as conversations around Measure B were really at their height. That is mandatory condom use. And at first, again, like even having been in these movements, I thought like, this is wild, because porn workers in a different way than I think other sex workers movements were making appeals to personal freedom and freedom of speech in ways that were unfamiliar to me in terms of how, say, like full service workers organize. And I had to make sense of that. But yeah, part of that, eventually I got to a place of thinking that these appeals for recognition of porn workers' work to the extent that they invite state regulation, that there's a place that we can critique that isn't libertarianism that only helps directors.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, like Caitlin's coming from, from a full service perspective, but I think there's something that's still interesting about, that perspective, that we can think across sex work categories.
Absolutely. And I also think in terms of the connections between this story and the movement more broadly, I do think that porn work offers a kind of laboratory for thinking about what decrim might look like. And it's not an entirely great one, right? It's like, it does remind us that work still sucks, even when it's not criminalized.
Sometimes there's a way in which people get caught up on decrim, like thinking that is going to change the way that people think about sex workers, when there's a lot of forms of sex work that aren't criminalized, but are still like so heavily stigmatized and still subject to, the boss. So I think, both of those things together. So
not just bosses, but also like systemic exclusion. I think it's important, the way that in algorithmic management, I mean, all of those things, right? So lack of access to payment processing, exclusion from spaces, online, but also like inability to cross borders, so there's like all sorts of ways in which things don't necessarily have to be overtly criminalized to still result in in limited freedom, and autonomy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think all of that, and the piece where I think the book does want to take us into this kind of porn work as unexceptional territory, is to remind that even if the stigma were addressed, even if payment processor discrimination and shadow banning and all of these incredible forms of state and institutional violence were addressed, then workers are still dealing with the problems of work under capitalism. So I think to hold both of those things together is in many ways the task that I was trying to follow through with.
Right. Specifically speaking, like, I guess you are taking a Marxist perspective-ish. I should pose that as a question, so, but
perspective-ish.
It sounds like at least that was a question you had to confront with some of your interviewees, but throughout the process. But I say that only, to say that when you're talking about, the kinds of problems people address under capitalism, we're talking about things like alienation and, exploitation, or kind of the classic Marxist critiques of, labor, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, PJ, you're giving me a preview as to what Orthodox Marxists will say, that this is Marxist-ish. So I'm glad for the heads up. Yeah, it's a Marxism that is deliberately unfaithful to some of Marxism's tenets.
Yeah. Oh, that wasn't meant to be a critique at all. I just simply opening the door to that line of conversation. And take this from someone who has experienced a great deal of criticism for my own unorthodox interpretations of Marxism. You're in good company, but
you got a lot of that with some of your articles. Huh?
Not worth going down this rabbit hole. But yeah, I definitely upset a lot of conventional Marxists with my interpretations of social media 10 years ago.
Oh yeah, they're really weird about that.
They're really weird, and it was yeah. Anyways, but it's it's fine. Everything, you have to fit all the square pegs into the round hole of Marx is writing about factories. So
right.
Anyways, back to
sorry, PJ.
out of the weeds. There's a number of things we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really struck me about the book is the way that you talked about how, at least in a contemporary context, and we can sort of talk as this is also true historically, but in a contemporary context, how porn is no longer really a singular source of income, or is not really plausible to make a living just doing porn. And that increasingly people use porn as a sort of self-advertising or a self-branding as kind of a launching pad to offer other sorts of products or services. And that's, a part of the story that I don't hear told very often. I mean, as you mentioned in the book, there's been some reporting in the media on this, but I really don't think anyone in an academic context is talking about this. And I think in general, like the public's has a misunderstanding of like what it means to be a porn star, and, assume that people in the industry are actually probably making a lot more money than they really are, at least, directly from their work.
Absolutely. And I think there's a piece of this where some self-identified porn stars have overrepresented that as a way to kind of place themselves up the hierarchy, to say, because I think that there's, and I'm wary of the ways that I hopefully, I don't know, fans don't read this and think otherwise, but there's always this risk that revealing that that's not true will kind of puncture the myth of not needing money, of doing this for other reasons. And that was something I was, very acutely aware of.
Yeah, you and I had a conversation about this recently. I think clients often don't want to give money to sex workers or to performers if they think it's for necessities.
Yeah. Right.
Because that that for some reason incites like some sort of like liberal guilt or something. At least that's been like my experience. So, and I will admit this. If I tell my clients that I want $75 to get my nails done, they'll give it to me much more readily than if I say I want groceries or something, Right. And I happen to like to get my nails done, so that's, nice. But I think there's something about the psychology of that a lot of times sex workers don't want to talk about, because it kind of demystifies like the presentation and the advertising that goes into sex work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, as you saw in the book, one thing that I'm really concerned with is the ways that differently situated feminist scholars are contributing to that by focusing on forms of porn work that they assume are not financially motivated.
Yeah.
Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this kind of liberal guilt that Jesse's talking about comes, I think, in fact, as a reaction to radical feminist critiques of porn and sex work as always forced. I think that's exactly where clients' preoccupation with seeing providers who don't need the money, I think that it comes in large part from that, in addition to, their own interest in mystifying the fact of paying for sex. There's another conversation for another day. But I think when we're talking about porn, there's this interesting dynamic where anti-porn feminists have made the argument that porn is violence because people do it because they need money. And many feminists who position themselves as allies have countered that with, I think, non-representative examples of people who perform for other reasons. And I think in meeting anti-porn feminists on their own terms, this locks the conversation in a territory that is really pretty unhelpful for workers on the ground who, like people in other jobs, have a messy set of reasons for working, one of which being paying rent but also, performance and pleasure being other real ones too.
Yeah, I think that there is something so interesting that happens with like sex work or erotic labor in which it's held to, a standard that other forms of labor are not held to at all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, and part of that, and you mentioned this in the book, comes with that idea of enthusiastic consent, right? And
Right.
so, and you cite that great essay by Charlotte Shane, which I teach every semester because I love it so much. But talks about the shortcomings of this idea of enthusiastic consent. But I think in this case, it kind of plays out in this expectation. It seems like there's a real connection between that idea of, doing porn because you just really love it, or, because maybe you're asking for money because you want these luxuries that you want to enjoy rather than, doing it because it's a job. And
absolutely.
I think as Charlotte Shane talks about in that piece, she, and as you know, but just for the listeners, she's talking about working as an escort, and talks about how she's consenting to do the work, but she's consenting to do the work because she's wants the money, and she's excited about the money she's going to make, but not necessarily excited about the sex she's going to have to make that money. In the same way that you might go to a food service job and be excited if you get a big tip, but not necessarily, excited to have to, be forced to go to work every day because you live in a capitalist society.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I had my share of bartending jobs where I was sort of compelled by management to pretend I cared about, which varietal of hops or the bathtub bitters, whatever. So, I mean, I think that that's sometimes happens in other kinds of service work, but not to this level of intensity. And yeah, I think it's really a problem that self-defined allies and even porn workers who become management reassert this in various ways by suggesting that good porn is porn that people do because they don't need money, and that ethical viewing is to view people who have a more detached relationship to work. I think that's something that certainly that, feminist scholarship should not reinforce.
And that really ties into the discussion of authenticity, which is, one of the major sections of your book, and the way that like authenticity can kind of be taken up almost as a brand, within porn. But do you want to say a little more about like what kind of role authenticity plays in this porn economy?
I think it can be a brand, and one that, really explicitly is trying to allay consumers' concerns around the ethics of viewing. And I think that it can also be a labor management strategy. So that's true to the extent that, again, I think this is true in some ways, but just in a much less intensified sense. In all sorts of jobs, especially under late capitalism, where you're not really allowed to say that you're doing this for money. And I mean, that's sort of a trope, right? Like a comic trope when we're talking about office jobs, that you have to talk about teamwork and like, being part of the Google family or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think civilians can acknowledge that that's ridiculous when you're talking about, being a teammate at Starbucks, but they still have this need to imagine that their porn exists outside of that dynamic.
My son was one time a sandwich artist at Subway.
God, right?
And he was like, "Mom, I'm a sandwich artist."
That was like a family meme for like a year.
Right. I mean,
because he hated making sandwiches.
But the absurdity of it was so
it's so absurd. And then, I mean, back to what you were asking earlier about the sort of like outlaw status of folks who are, drawn to the industry. I think it's so interesting that a lot of directors who fancy themselves as like these renegade cowboys, like, are also talking about work like someone who owns a Subway franchise. Right? like it's not actually that edgy to require people to pretend to be your friend as a boss, or I mean, so I do think that connection like should be embarrassing, right?
Right. So this is a little bit off your book, but I want to ask you what you think about this. So I feel like the same pressure exists within academia very, very strongly to pretend like you don't need to make any money and that you're in it for like the love of learning or for the good or the beautiful or like I mean, I'm obviously talking from the perspective of somebody who is in philosophy, but I'm curious what you think the like overlaps between those things are, what your experience has been like, you know, as an academic compared to how like this sort of like pressure to talk about your work is like very important or very good or very fulfilling just on its own without monetary compensation.
Those pressures are so real in academia. And I'll say that it's at like precisely at those moments where I think the book conceals the connections least that when I present to academic audiences, people are most upset. So whether that be talking about, that we work for the cash, but also, especially in my field in feminist studies, feminists do not like to hear that feminist management is still management. They and that asking employees to, or in this case, in the porn case, independent contractors, right, to pretend to be your friend can be abusive. Like that elicits a lot of reactivity, say on the conference circuit. So I think there are so many connections. I'll also just say, in terms of putting myself back in the story, that workers aren't stupid for seeking out jobs that feel less tedious. And I think that one thing that I find really strange is that there are so many academic critiques of authenticity at work that don't acknowledge that we all have sought out a field that allows us to also work from home, to also do something that feels less alienated. And so you can see all of these really condescending, I think, theorizations of work that feels personal, you know, and you can imagine that the people writing them are at home on their couch next to their dog, you know, writing at 10 p.m. on a Sunday, right? Like,
right.
So
Absolutely.
I think, I always try to, especially in teaching this, like recognize that these are shared investments, and that it can both be true that, you know, that I'm working in an academic capacity for rent money, and also that like a lot of sex workers, you know, I've chosen a job that feels less crushing to me in some ways, and that matters too. And that the less crushingness makes me work more, you know, both of those things are true.
So one of the things in the book that, you know, maybe I wanted to highlight is you do take on kind of sex positivity and pleasure, and not to, you know, not that you're just like, you know, forget pleasure and, you know, but that I think you complicate some of the approaches both from like feminists and sex work organizers that kind of emphasize like sex positivity and pleasure as a politics. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and about why you're a little bit critical of that.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll say too that again, that these ethnographic encounters pushed my own politics on this. So I had published prior to starting this research, I think a much more straightforward critique of sex positivity in sex worker movements, and that was coming from, not from ethnography, but just from my own, frankly, my own frustrations with having been involved in these movements and feeling like, in an effort to disidentify with this anti-sex worker claim that people do this work because they are forced to out of economic necessity, that there was this inordinate focus on pleasure, on performance, And I think that can have really profoundly racist and classist effects on how we talk about what workers count, and what kinds of claims that they might be able to make. So this idea that there are like two totally separate groups of sex workers, some who come into the industry in a pleasure-seeking way, and with really distant relationship to economic need, and then others who are doing just bare survival, who have no capacity to find play or pleasure or interventions in their day-to-day. And I think that that's really dangerous. So that's that piece. But also interviewees pushed back on what I came with, the idea that this is really, like, again, work in a more straightforward sense. And people did talk about the ways that the pleasure matters for them as an intervention into what work is supposed to mean, under capitalist social relations. And so what I'm trying to do is, on the one hand, critique sex positivity's tendency to take class out of the picture in conversations about sex work, to ask us to forget that a director is still a boss, all of these things. And on the other hand, to really take seriously that one of the things that porn workers are fleeing from in straight work isn't, it's not just tedium and long hours and low pay, but it's also work that isn't fun, and connective, and that doesn't feel good. And their pleasure, including sexual pleasure, like, absolutely matters. And I'm just really grateful to interviewees for pushing me on that. I think the conversation in porn work on that is different, in some ways more complicated than it is in full service contexts, which is where a lot of my thinking was coming from. And that's, that we can have these like critiques of what it's like to deal with clients, and that looks quite different than the conversations that some folks are having about playfulness and pleasure, and even sometimes desire on a porn set.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's actually one of the interesting things about porn in particular, because it's, the marketing and stuff is client directed. Clients aren't part of the labor,
Right.
and that makes it a very sort of different experience. I mean, I think that's changing a lot because of things like OnlyFans and subscription sites, and the fact that in order to sell your porn, there's like so much client interaction.
Yeah.
But I think that like the production itself isn't with clients, it's with other performers.
But again, that's changing. I think that's one of the great things this book does, is points out that isn't a viable business model anymore, right? Like you have to do that and have client-facing interaction to survive, right? And so, like, I think that, that's something we probably should talk about more. But I think part of the problem is that, I don't know, prior to this book, we haven't had much, like, people don't have a good sense of the actual economics of the industry, and particularly like the like personal economics of the workers and like what they have to do to get by. And so I think like so much of the focus of when the focus isn't on the text itself, which is where the focus of analysis usually is, it's on the set.
Right.
But I think, really, I think we know that, to have a viable business at this point in time, or to like make enough money to live, you probably do have to, either, I mean, I guess back in the day it was probably more, doing featured dances, but today it's more like OnlyFans and
and in-person services and stuff. And I think that there's something interesting too. I mean, I'm totally agreeing with you. I think there's something interesting about the way that a lot of like rhetoric around sex work is reflective of marketing that doesn't actually reflect what's going on, because there's a lot of slippage between all of these like categories, even though like some people are promoting themselves as porn performers and some people are promoting themselves as phone sex operators and some people are promoting themselves as other things, but that doesn't mean that there's not overlap between all of those categories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, social media theorists, like you don't hear this as much anymore, but like 10 years ago, you'd hear a lot of talk about context collapse and like the way the different parts of, our lives are collapsing into each other. It's hard to perform different roles for different audiences because you're visible to all the different audiences at once on social media. Mm-hmm. And I definitely think that's something that, that sex workers struggle with, is that you're like simultaneously having to market and organize from the same account.
Yeah.
Right.
And that can really be in tension. Those two things can really be in tension with each other.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a comment on just like how creative and crafty sex workers are, that they manage to do that gymnastics. I think I really think that a lot of, of worker organizers in other fields would be paralyzed at the thought. So, I think it's amazing that people are able to do both of those things at the same time.
You managed to incorporate the phrase underwear dialectics into a published book, and I think that's worthy of taking time to honor and note.
It's so funny that came up on the other podcast I've done on this so far. That one is sticking with folks.
It's just so funny. I mean, it is both completely apt and like a comically like juxtaposition between like a really academic term and something that's not so serious.
Yeah. Well, when reviewer suggested I call it panty dialectics, and I absolutely refused. So we'll keep it with underwear. Yeah. I mean, do you want me to talk about what I'm getting at with that?
I totally do, but I just want to also note that I was told by my committee that I had to change any mention of panties to underwear in order for my dissertation to be approved. But go ahead. Maybe
that's my own respectability politics, that I just find the word panties kind of cringy. But you're encouraging me to reflect on that. I mean, so what I think is, so just as I've been returning to this theme of how creative porn workers are, and how important a dialectical lens is, if we want to really recognize that creativity. I think that what happens with lingerie is just a really interesting like microcosm of that. So from a kind of orthodox labor perspective, one would tell the story that with the neoliberal move to place the cost of doing business onto workers' shoulders, employers in porn and elsewhere are increasingly requiring workers to buy their own supplies. And that's totally true, that most porn sets don't have wardrobe anymore, and that workers have to provide all sorts of things from, paying for an STI test to their lingerie that they can't wear again, often full hair and makeup that's no longer provided. So all of that's true, that's a way that directors offload the expenses that, that go directly into their profit onto workers' shoulders. And it's expensive and burdensome for workers. Mm-hmm. But where the dialectical piece comes in is that, again, sex workers are just really smart and have figured out a way to encourage fans to buy lingerie for them through wish lists, then to wear those, again, using the scene as an advertisement, and then sell them back to fans used. And one of my greatest pleasures, talk about the pleasure piece, one of my greatest pleasures in doing this research was hearing management bitch about all of the hacks they didn't think of. And that was one of them. And it was often that directors and producers and agents sometimes would talk about how dumb their clients were or their workers. And And then like a moment later, say, and I really wish I'd thought of that. And I think that is art.
Yeah, I love that in the book. You say like, they in the one breath they describe the workers as not being smart, and then in the very next breath talk about being outsmarted.
Yeah. Yeah, that was true all of the time. And I guess just as we're on this thread of how directors are seeing this, I think you've both been returning us to this kind of move to diversification and OnlyFans, and another piece here that I found really interesting was just observing directors' growing resentment and even panic at the possibility that workers could use them rather than being used as a site of profit generating. And I think that's something we should really pay attention to, and that a kind of lament about gigification really misses.
Yeah, that there's something destabilizing about that shifting relationship where now the management or the owners can be used and not just the users.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't mean destabilizing in terms of like, disruption narratives, like liberal, techno-liberalist disruption, but like there's actually disruption happening on all sorts of planes. Some of it's good for workers, some of it's not. But it's not such a clean process.
Yeah. I was also thinking about destabilization just in terms of egos, but
yeah, well, I mean, that is real. Egos are a material thing too.
I was thinking about the fact that a lot of people who've been conventional, like studio porn performers, how when COVID hit and they could no longer do sort of the studio porn, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that they don't know that they need to return to that anymore, that they're making just as much, if not more money working on their own from their house as they were, especially people who were already established. So, they could leverage the kind of fame that they gain doing that to then no longer need that.
Absolutely. I think that's an amazing thing about this historical moment and the ways that workers have figured out how to intervene in it that management just like really cannot even begin to conceptualize.
I recently interviewed Lena Paul, and she said, as one of the very big porn stars right now, she's like, I think we're in a moment of the death of the porn star, and I think that's a good thing. And I thought it was interesting to hear her say that.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, that is. I feel like that could be read in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because it's, historically, too, if we look at like, the kind of labor relations aspect of the, historically, producers and studios were necessary insofar as like they were the primary mechanisms of distribution. And like, in order for a performer to be visible, they had to rely upon these distribution mechanisms that were kind of exclusively in the hands of management, or at least they had those relationships that it was really hard to make independently as a performer. But now, we're all relying on the same, algorithms, right? And an individual performer can try to hack the Pornhub algorithm, just as easily as a studio, and we're, all kind of competing in the same space. And so there are a lot of performers who have done an end run around the studio system and who are, up there in the top, alongside people who emerged, in a more conventional way through studio contracts. And I think
Absolutely.
that, it's just interesting to think about like what kind of threat that poses to those systems, and if those systems are even going to be able to, like if studios are going to even be able to continue to justify their existence if people are able to, achieve the same level of exposure without their assistance.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think the point is not to celebrate that disruption, because obviously there are all sorts of new forms of extraction and, as you say, algorithmic management and censorship that take the place of the studio model. But again, that's where dialectical framework seems really crucial here, so that at the same time that old school management is confronting its own obsolescence, that OnlyFans is, has increased power to control how people make a living. I mean, both of those things are happening at the same time.
Right. Which, if nothing else, seems to mean that, feminist critique needs to kind of catch up to the new production models, because I do think that so much of what's been written in the last 50 years is still really imagining like Boogie Nights or Deep Throat or whatever, and the industry has moved so far from that. Which isn't to say that there aren't these problems that you're describing, or these exploitative relationships, that they're just not locked in the same exploitative relationships that have preoccupied the feminist imagination for however 50 years now.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, I think it's very disturbing to me to see feminist commentators find themselves disappointed by that, right? Like that I can tell that part of the story, and there's almost this sense of loss that they don't have the same concrete enemy. And so even if I explain that this is good for workers in a lot of ways, that it means more autonomy, it means more control over the thing that most feminist commentators care about, which is like what the scene actually looks like, but also just working conditions and pay and all of it. But still that there's this like yearning for a known and visible enemy that doesn't feel as satisfying when we're starting to think about algorithms.
Yeah, well, and it provides a sort of sense of social belonging or something if you have, an enemy to unite around.
Absolutely.
And that becomes more difficult, which, is understandable. I mean, it does make organizing easier, but going back to that Lenin quote, right? I mean, ultimately it's the truth that's revolutionary. And okay, one final question about the book. I'm just curious, because I think it's, in doing journalism and doing also, doing academic research, I think, one of the struggles we have are that the people who are most willing to respond are people who already, tend to have a certain high profile, people who are established in a certain way. Also people who tend to be a bit more community minded, and see this kind of public discourse as something that's good for the community. And so they'll, willingly give up their time for that.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, what you think about how that has shaped the book, and, maybe who's missing from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think in some ways that bore out in this case. But in others, I think that and I don't actually know that this kind of methodological approach would even make sense now, given that something like AVN doesn't exist in the way even that it did 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, there are a lot of like recognizable names in this book, activists, folks who are also writers in their own terms, much more artfully so than me. And folks who are community minded in the way that you're describing. But there are also a lot of folks who I met, while I was waiting on a low paid gonzo set, and, because of the ways that folks are paid not by the hour, but by the scene, and have to do a lot of waiting around. A lot of people talked to me because they were bored. And, in that way, I suppose I profited from the kind of time wasting that directors do all the time. But yeah, so I think that in that sense, like those voices are not missing. And then, just the kind of process of walking around the exhibition floor at AVN, at various expos, and like just seeing if people would be willing to talk to me, I think that a pretty wide swath of folks, would be able to recognize themselves in this book. I think there are other methodological things that, that I'm less comfortable with. And so it's not that I'm defending it in a global sense, but I think in terms of like who's represented here, I feel at the very least, because of all of the ways that people inside the book are disagreeing with each other, but also just in terms of the different entry points in terms of folks, experience of the kinds of films that they shoot, how much money they make from them, all of this. I think it is pretty representative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course that was not meant to be a critique at all, but
totally.
rather just a curious as someone who's both of us, Jesse and I, struggle with these same issues, and it's something we think about a lot. The one challenge I think, in particular with that though, is as the means of production decentralize, right? When we're talking about, being on set, for example, I mean, we're, talking about a world where, most of the porn production is happening in like Southern California and Vegas and Miami. And there are like, a handful of concrete places where these studios are operating and you could go and be on set. But the world we seem to be moving towards is one where that is like really, really diffuse. And there are lots of people, all spread out all over the country, who are doing this kind of work, in their own bedrooms. And I do wonder if it's harder to reach some of those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and I think the piece of the kind of the methods piece that I still haven't resolved, like my, discomfort with is this question of whether the intrusion is defensible, right? Like, so I don't have actually a sense that there's some that like academic work is worthwhile on its own terms in a way that merits, especially now, right? Like the intrusion into someone's home. And I think for me, I think the process would feel different. And in ways that I'm not sure that I could have done it with as much ease, either logistically or otherwise, in this moment.
I hear that. If I can push back on that just a little bit. And
sure.
On the other hand, I think most sex workers that you would talk to would tell you that academic feminism in the past 50 years has done real and appreciable harm to sex workers and the sex worker rights movement. And that working within academia to counter or challenge some of those narratives may be one of the most effective pressure points on undoing or mitigating some of those harms. And that probably doesn't sound like a question because it's really just me, expressing what keeps me up at night and how I am justifying this work myself. But I want to put that out there because I think that's, I don't know, that's how I justify it. And I'm curious how you would respond to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate the kind word. I think that that we just have to sit with the ambivalence around this. And so, if I thought I was doing harm, I wouldn't be doing this. But I do think that whereas when I started graduate school, I had dreams of, using my unearned fancy title, right, to change minds. And I think, maybe that's possible, but I do think that, if I'm being clear-eyed about it, that the most useful I can be is to, now that I've got my claws in an institution, like figure out ways to redirect money to people, figure out if I get paid to talk about this book, like the money goes directly not to me. Like those kinds of things I think probably matter more than anything that's in the book. And then just, I think more than anything I could ever write, being able to lie and pretend to be somebody's landlord so they can get an apartment. I think there are like ways to make oneself useful. But yeah, I do have a lot, and I'm so heartened by like your kind words. And I think, hearing from workers that, when what I write resonates like that, it's the only thing I care about. So all of that. And also I think, some humility around that is really warranted.
I think that's actually a really good place to end.
Yeah, on my existential crisis.
No, I mean,
I think it's a real struggle, and I think if you weren't having that struggle, that would be a problem, and that's probably, that's probably why the book comes off as so real, so accurate.
Yeah.
To those of us who've lived these things.
Thank you.
I'm also like a fan of dialectic, so I think that like being able to hold like conflicting ways of thinking about something is really important.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm glad that piece landed.
Yeah, definitely. It was really, really great to talk to you. Can you tell people where to find the book and where they could find more of your work?
Sure. So you can find the book at my press website. That's UNC Press. Right now it's 40% off with a link to that in my pinned tweet at Dr. Heather Berg. You can find more about my work in general at drheatherberg.com.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for the book. And thank you for talking with us about it today.
Thank you so much. It was really, really such a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.